Balcha, welcome back. This is part 6 of Stoned by Aja RADEN. We just learned all about jewels and the Russian Empire and how they funded, with the help of an American who was a spy, to help establish the USSR. Now we're on part 3, have industry, innovation, and the light at the end of the tunnel. What can a jewel do? It can save a civilization, it can change time, how things change the world. That's what this is about. So chapter 7, the boss's string. This is a very interesting story. Pearl culture, cultured pearls, and Japan's race to modernity. In 1603, Japan isolated itself from the rest of the world. July 8, 1853, Admiral Matthew Perry took 4 warships to deliver a letter of introduction from the United States President with trade agreements. And it was definitely a show of force, basically telling the Japanese, play ball with the rest of the world. The Japanese basically were forced to sign and thrust onto the global stage for the first time in a couple hundred years. They decided, well, if you can't fight them, join them. And they decided to dump their entire feudal culture and catch up. They sent floods of students to Europe and the US to study. They imported Western advisors as experts to train people. They retrained their samurai, which were their military guys, to be a modern military. They built and grew industries like steamships and textiles. They invented cultured pearls, which made Japan a superpower. So we're talking about Kokichi Mikimoto, born 1858, the son of poor noodle maker. And his dad became ill when he was quite young, and Mikimoto had to support his family. They lived near the coast. He knew that pearls were valuable, and they were often ground up in the cities of Japan and used in medicine. He eventually married the daughter of a samurai at the age of 23. He wanted to be a scientist. And keep in mind that until this point, right before this, the culture of Japan was completely intransigent. You were stuck in the class that you were born into. There was no movement between classes. And for a poor commoner to want to be an educated scientist and to marry a samurai's daughter, was a crossing of classes, and it would have been impossible. He just happened to be born at just the right time. He eventually worked his way up into the fish and marine associations, and he met a scientist who thought that the culturing of pearls was a viable idea. In 1892, red tide killed all of the oysters that they were experimenting with, 5,000 of them. They managed to rescue one bed, and they got 5 successful cultured pearls. In 1896, he got the patent. He coated a seed in donor tissue, and it worked. Now, this goes into the whole process of how they did it, and it grossed me out. I felt sorry for the oysters, so I know it's crazy, but it was just disgusting. So suffice it to say that it's not a pleasant process, and it wasn't easy. In 1905, red tide killed 850,000 oysters, and amongst all of the dead, he sat and went through all these dead oysters. That must have been fun. He found 5 perfect pearls that were perfect spheres, and he realized, oh my God, I finally got it to work, and was shocked. Keep in mind that a pearl forms when the oyster encapsulates an infection or a wound or debris with a bodily secretion called nacre. It's a pearly looking secretion when it hardens. And this doesn't necessarily form in a perfect circle. This forms roughly around the thing. Well, Mikimoto figured out a way to get it to form in a circle. He then created an entire system of pearl farming, Before that, pearls, they would jump off the cliffs into the water and find naturally occurring oyster beds. By the 1920s, he became one of Japan's top scientists. They were able to perfectly combine technology and nature. Even the ground up pearls that they had were used. They ground up the bad ones and they used them in supplements like for calcium and in makeup. He dedicated his first crop to the emperor. He was all about Japan, about his national loyalty, and not about himself. So before 1600, Japan was ruled by clashing feudal lords, and it was destabilized by Christian missionaries. They would come in and try to convert people, and then that would cause religious tension, big clash of cultures. In 1600, there was the Battle of Sekigahara. Tokugawa Ieyasu, and I'm sorry, but I'm doing my best, consolidated Japan into one united group rather than warring lords. And he established himself in a castle in Edo, which became Tokyo. And he took complete power as a shogun, a supreme military commander, and he created a dynasty that lasted 2.5 centuries. He restored a lot of things. This became a very structured, very controlled society. He restored Bushido, which was a philosophical code of behavior. It emphasized discipline and self-sacrifice and perfectionability. Anything could be made perfect, and that was your goal. He restored Shinto and Buddhism, traditional religion of Japan, and kicked all the Christians out. He threw out all the foreigners. He saw Christianity as a political divisive and socially disruptive force, and that it caused wars. He could see that it caused wars elsewhere, and he gave the peasants a higher power over local feudal lords. And no, I said that wrong. He had a local feudal lord that had power over the peasants, and he made foreign trade gone because he thought it was unfair. It did not help Japan, and he considered military presence of other countries and colonization from other countries a huge threat. So in 1639, he declared Sakoku, the policy of closed country. Christianity was outlawed. Contact with foreigners was forbidden. Westerners were expelled. No one was allowed in or out of Japan. Shipwrecked sailors were sent back to sea to survive on their own, or they were killed, or they were imprisoned. One small island of Nagasaki, off Nagasaki, was reserved for Dutch traders. You know, the Dutch, they're all about the business. This island was called Dejima. It was strictly isolated. And as I said, the motto of the Dutch East India Company was Christ is good, but trade is better. Japan did interact with China and Korea, but not with the West. Between 1603 and 1867 is the Edo Period. It's a period of peaceful, sleepy seclusion. They were prosperous. Agriculture and economy grew. The wealthy and the educated merchant class lived in Osaka and Kyoto. The arts blossomed. This was the time that developed kabuki theater, bunraku puppets, haiku and poetry, the art of geisha, woodblock printing. All of this was invented, developed, designed, created during this time. The religion existed, but it was very mellow. But this was an inflexible society. There was no class mobility. It was a pyramid at the very top. The imperial family, they were gods. Under them, the shogun class, they were in control. Beneath them, the samurai, who were the privileged warrior nobility. Beneath them, sort of a bourgeois class of artists, performers, craftsmen, and merchants. And then the rest of the country, 80% of the population, peasants. There were rules against recreational activities outside your class. You were born into a class, you were only allowed to be certain places, do certain things, eat certain stuff, wear certain stuff, really, and you could not intermarry. The samurai were not allowed to engage in commerce. They were military. The peasants were only allowed to farm, and both of them were resentful of the nobility. And while Japan was isolated, I don't know what I was going to read you here. Let's see. While Japan was isolated, from the rest of the world for more than 2.5 centuries, it missed a few things like the collapse of Spain, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, the globalization of the British commercial empire, the formation of the United States, the Industrial Revolution. Through their tiny Dutch keyhole, a handful of Japanese academics stayed informed of world developments, which they referred to as Dutch studies. Nothing they learned could have prepared them for the shocking reality of Commodore Perry and his fleet's aggressive arrival on their shores. The first thing that the villagers and sailors in Uraga saw on July 8, 1853, was as terrifying as it was inexplicable. A giant black cloud of smoke on the horizon, like some massive thing burning out over the open water. The sight was so terrifying that all the scattered fishing boats along the coast frantically rowed for shore, while the people on land ran for cover, convinced that the smoke must be coming from dragons. It was the stuff of nightmares. The village was thrown into a panic. Bells rang, alarms sounded. Some hysterical villagers shouted, "Giant dragons puffing smoke," while others, where did that go? I lost my place. While others with either a clearer head or just a clearer view cried alien ships of fire. It was only moments before the villagers on land could also see the unfathomably enormous monsters that had terrified the fishermen out of the water. 4 towering black iron ships approaching, burning coal, billowing smoke, glowing from their portholes, and bristling with guns and cannons. Actual dragons might have been less frightening. As the black ships approached, people scattered. Some hid in their homes, others headed for the hills. A few scrambled for the capital not far away to tell the shogun what was happening. The most level-headed among them realized that this could only be a return of the southern barbarians they had so long ago expelled, now wielding great power and terrible machines. The ships were as strange and intimidating as Columbus's giant wooden galleons had been to the New World. During their period of isolation, the Japanese had sailed only short distances along their own coasts, using the same small wooden one-sailed junks they had always used. But the West had continued to circle the globe for both war and commerce in increasingly large, fast, powerful ships. In 1600, traversing the Pacific was dangerous and difficult, and few attempted the trip. In 1853, a voyage from San Francisco to Japan took only a breezy 18 days. Perry waited offshore a week, periodically shooting guns. Then he brought more than 300 heavily armed soldiers and a marching band and landed on shore. They brought a letter from the president to the emperor, and Perry thought he'd take the opportunity to inflate his own self-importance, that he didn't know that the emperor was symbolic and had no power, that the shogun was in charge. Negotiations were really demands with thinly veiled threats of violence. They wanted 2 ports opened for trade with the West. They wanted access to coal, water, and resupplying. They wanted better treatment for Western castaways. They declared, Perry, just after a couple of days of getting nowhere, declared the negotiations over and left for Hong Kong with the threat that they would be back for an answer. The shogunate freaked out. What were they going to do? They returned, Perry did, in 6 months with 10 ships. The Japanese signed the treaties. For very long, Japan held no allure to the West, but the U.S. Was really into Western expansion, and they wanted access to better whaling. And the Japanese had a rich source of whaling off their waters. Whaling disturbs me greatly. Whale oil was in huge demand. It was used for lighting, it was used for industrial lubrication, and for whalebone for corsets. There was a coup in Japan. People were mad that they had signed this treaty with the West, and there was a coup, and they overthrew the shogun who were the signers. And in 1868 to 1912, the Meiji Restoration occurred. Japan emerged into the 20th century. Modernization began. Western clothes were adopted, cities were rebuilt, buildings were torn down and replaced with Western buildings. The Japanese ruthlessly abandoned centuries of old cultural traditions. They dismantled the feudal system completely. The samurai Yataro, who made swords, famous Japanese samurai swords, found a new use for his steel. He opened the Mitsubishi factory. Mikimoto was a product of that period. Now we're back to pearls. This poor peasant, because of this modernization, was able to marry the daughter of a samurai, something unheard of before. He was allowed to study. He became an inventor and a businessman and a scientist, and he became known as the Pearl King of the world. Japan was so successful that it was able to fight in World War I and to take its own colonies. Before this, in Japan, beauty and art were sacrosanct. Everything was about the perfection and balance of tasks and of objects. This modernization was a battle between the ancient and the modern, and it was called Fokuku Kyohei. Enrich the country and strengthen the economy. That was the motto. In 2 years, they caught up. 2 years. They built a railroad that crisscrossed all of the islands. They built steamships, industries, colonial holdings, commercial enterprises, and thanks to pearls, they were able to overtake the West by the 1930s, and then they dominated in the pearl industry. Their method of culturing pearls, I wrote, this is where they describe it in the book, and I simply wrote, gross. The pearls grew in about 4 years, which is very fast compared to how long it takes other gems to form, millions of years. So the people had tried to culture pearls for millennia. There's a bit of a history of it. Apollonius of Tyana in the 1st century describes the Arabian culturing pearls. The Chinese did not succeed in getting round ones, but they succeeded in getting irregular shaped pearls. Linnaeus in the 1750s claimed that he could do it using limestone, but however he was able to figure it out is lost to history because his papers were lost for 150 years. Pearls from nature were never perfect, never identical, due to the DNA of the oyster they came from and whatever it was that started the formation of the pearl to begin with. And they were usually smaller than a pencil eraser. The oysters had a short lifespan and they would die before they could make a bigger pearl. They only lived 6 to 8 years, and that would limit the size of the pearls. Mikimoto went global and he shook up the entire pearl industry. And his pearls were valuable because they were scarce. By 1938, 350 pearl farms were in Japan, making 10 million pearls a year. Natural pearls, there were a dozen to a few hundred a year. He gutted the jewelry business. The prices dropped by 85% in 1 day for pearl jewelry. The natural pearl dealers wanted to prove that Mikimoto pearls were not real, and they sued him and called his pearls fraudulent. He fought back with the science of the whole process, and the experts in court agreed with him, and he was supported by Edison, and he won the suit, and the jewelry industry could do nothing about him. The dealers tried to tax the pearls and impose weird labeling regulations, but nothing worked and nothing prevented his success. He went on a campaign at that point, Cultured is Real and Better, and touted the uniformity and size of his pearls. He made huge public thing out of educating and entertaining people about his pearls. He made a model Mount Vernon, Washington's home, out of 24,328 pearls, which was displayed at the 1933 Chicago World Fair. He made a 5-story pagoda out of 12,760 pearls. He made a Liberty Bell for the 1939 New York Fair out of 12,250 pearls, 366 diamonds, and the crack was made out of very rare blue pearls. He did a publicity stunt where he took buckets and buckets of 720,000 what he called not good enough, worthless pearls, and burned them in public. He created desire for the unattainable pearl with the Taisho Ren. And the Taisho Ren was the boss's string, which was this incredible string of perfect pearls. And I will read you about that as soon as I find it. And what are we to do as humans when there's nothing left to want? Mikimoto found a solution to that particular problem, the Taisho Ren, as his employees called it, or the boss's string of pearls. Quite simply, Mikimoto created a strand of pearls unparalleled in beauty and quality, even among cultured pearls, one that reestablished the presence and thus the value of the unattainable pearl. Choosing only the largest, most perfect, most beautiful matching pearls, he amassed a long, slightly graduated strand of 49 pearls, the largest of which was 14.5 millimeters, which is aberrantly large for a cultured pearl and almost impossible to find in naturally occurring ones. It took him over a decade to assemble it, even with millions of pearls a year to choose from. It was the most spectacular pearl necklace anyone had ever seen. In a world where natural pearls were an average of 2 millimeters, almost never over 8, and only a handful had ever been deemed perfect, the Taisho Ren was a wonder of the modern world. There was something to want again, and everyone did want it. Had it been for sale, it might have led to wars, feuds, and political tensions like those discussed in previous chapters. But it was not for sale, despite the plethora of offers he continued to receive. He declined them until his death. It is on permanent display at the Mikimoto Memorial Hall on Pearl Island in Toba, Japan. It's one of the few pieces deemed far too valuable to ever leave the island, which Asia was told in confidence by a representative from Mikimoto, and it is why it was not at the celebrated pearls exhibit the Victoria and Albert Museum hosted in London of 2013. And boy, I would have given anything to go to that if I'd known about it. The standard of perfection was simply impossible. Henry Ford, he was called the Henry Ford of precious gems. He standardized them to a standard of perfection that was absolutely unattainable in nature. The human brain is hardwired to look for symmetry and perfection. We are just drawn to symmetry and perfection. And Mikimoto inherently knew that and capitalized on it. The perception of beauty weakens when we start to recognize defects, and his pearls were perfect, and it devalued all the natural pearls because there's no such thing as a perfect natural pearl. They have slight irregularities, slight discolorations, and almost all natural pearls are antique now. I mean, you won't find very many modern natural pearls. Oysters dwindled, permits got difficult to obtain. And at the turn of the 20th century, pearl value was at an all-time high. In 1916, Cartier traded a one necklace of pearls for a New York City townhouse. And then he used that townhouse for his Fifth Avenue headquarters. That's a great story. As cultured pearls increased in value, natural pearls decreased in value. They're no longer just for nobility, Mikimoto wanted pearls to be available for everyone. He helped Japan excel on the global economy, and he helped to give it a new 20th century identity, and he democratized a gemstone. And now we have Chapter 8, Timing is Everything, World War I, and the First Wristwatch. This is fascinating. I had no idea. I'd never heard this story. Watches are paradoxical. They're mass-produced, which implies, but they imply status. They're functional and they're decorative. They are, their value is really in their mechanism, but they're often made of precious metals and gems. They keep time for the leisure class who don't need to know about time. They were used in war and industry. They started out as a feminine aberration in the jewelry world, and now they're a masculine necessity. I don't get watches. I have to tell you, I've never got watches. I don't understand their appeal. I don't like to wear a watch. I can't wear a watch. I have some weird energy thing going on that I've never had a watch that continued to work for more than a couple of weeks at the most. So wristwatches were invented 100 years ago. I didn't know that. Patek Philippe in 1868 made a wristwatch for the Countess Koskowitz. Said that wrong. They replaced a diamond in a bracelet with a miniature clock. It was key wound. It was called a wristlet. It was really a piece of jewelry, and it became the rage for all her rich friends. It became a military wristwatches became a military must for modern military who needed both hands free and needed to be able to coordinate time. And they were called strap watches. And the Allies were all issued wristwatches in World War I. After World War I, the demand grew and they became far more popular. And this was the first time that day going into night was just a measure of time. The first time that people started to really measure all of that was sundials, 1500 BC in Egypt. Then they had hourglasses and water clocks, which a measured amount moved at a fixed rate, and that's how they told the passage of time. In the Middle Ages, they used church bells, approximating the time of day by the position of the sun. Massive mechanical clocks were used publicly, but they weren't practical or affordable or available. In the Renaissance, they invented this pendulum and the spring clock, which became more accurate. During the Industrial Revolution, they needed clocks, factories, trains, timetables, workers. The idea that the hands of a clock go in a circle follows the path of the sun, and high noon is always at the top. That's why the 12 is always at the top. And it used to be Roman numerals and then eventually became regular numbers. In China, in 725 AD, the first clock was invented. It used water, which moved gears, and then weights and pulleys were used and to move the gears. And what they were doing, and Aja gets into the physics of that, and I don't do physics. It's against my religion, but basically it captures energy in the form of potential energy, winding, and transfers it into either gravitational or elastic energy, pulleys falling, and the gears are turned. You've now been entertained by the limits of my understanding of the Newtonian laws. With the invention of the balance spring in 1657, clocks became more accurate. Eye tracking, this is interesting, has shown that both genders stare the most at jewelry on people, addressing status, assets, rank, value. Used to think that men stared at women's bodies and women sort of assessed women for what to look like, but the reality is both genders stare at their jewelry. The primary function of jewelry is to stand out. It's an expression of advantage. It's to get attention, to enhance beauty. And I don't know if I 100% agree with that, maybe 99.9%, but there's also just the appeal of liking something. I think there's some truth to that. And I don't know, maybe it's connected and I don't understand that. It's subconscious. It's connected to status. But like my daughter gave me these years ago as a Christmas present or a birthday present. And I just absolutely love them. When I wear them, I think of her. So, there you go. But the fastest way to get attention and to communicate privilege is to possess a status symbol of jewelry. The first pocket watches were large and bulky and inaccurate, and they needed rewinding many times a day. They didn't last long, but they were in demand by the elite. And they got more elaborate in shape, and eventually they made pins with watches on them, and then they had chains with watches on them. They had one that had a death head because time was passing. They were the purview of the wealthy. They were priced like rare jewels. They were hard to find. Henry VIII had a pocket clock like a salad plate that he wore around his neck. Elizabeth I had an armlet on her upper arm. Marie Antoinette had a diamond bracelet that was a watch. The Renaissance ring watches were something new. They barely worked, but they conveyed wealth and privilege. Until the 19th century, watches were more for men because they were symbols of money and authority. In 1845, Philippe invented the stem winding mechanism and partnered with Patek. Queen Victoria became a customer and she got a lady's pocket watch. In 1810, Abraham Bourgeois, I'm not sure, made the first wristwatch for the Queen of Naples. It was held on the wrist with hair and gold, which just sounds disgusting, and didn't really keep accurate time, but it did include a thermometer. For wristwatches to get smaller, they got more expensive. The clock was basically the computer of its day. Men didn't want wristwatches because they were too much like women's bracelets and they were inaccurate. Jewelers thought they were just a passing fancy. Women who could afford them didn't do anything and didn't need to know what time it was. Men were busy, important. They punched a time card. His time was valuable, and the objection to a wristwatch was misogynistic. Men had pocket watches. The first serious men's wristwatches were used in World War I in the military. Well, actually, in the 1880s, the Imperial German Navy had what they called a strap watch. It was this leather strap with a circle that formed a little pocket with a rim, and you'd stick your pocket watch in that. Between the 1880s and 1902, the Boer War, which was a British land grab, diamonds in the Transvaal, the Orange River. The Boer Wars were the first modern wars that were a warm-up for World War I, and the British made leather straps with pockets for pocket watches, which had primitive cupped leather bands. And now wristwatches suddenly became manly, and women's were called bracelet watches, men's were called wristwatches. In 1904, Cartier designed an aviation watch for a friend who was a flyer, and it brought wristwatches more acceptable for men because aviators were like the macho guys, and all the men's groups wanted to have wristwatches: soldiers, aviators, and the wealthy. And finally, in World War I, coordinating accurate timing became vital, and it was vital to bomber pilots for calculating distance, speed, position, and attitude. And if they had a wristwatch, they could coordinate their attacks. The American Army was the first to have a standard issue wristwatch by 1917, and then the British War Department did too. Then they invented a second hand that ticked. It was called a hack. It would tick 1 second. It would move every second and tick, and that was a big deal. I'm looking here to see how we're doing for time. Okay, I'm going to make this just a little longer and finish. When the war was over, the watch became a badge of bravery. All these soldiers came home with their wristwatches from the war, trench watches, and by 1927, Wristwatches to pocket watches were manufactured at a rate of 50 wristwatches to 1 pocket watch. And they became a sexual status symbol for men. It was inappropriate, it was believed, for non-veterans to wear a wristwatch. Is that not hilarious? That just cracks me up. Because if you didn't go to the war and get your wristwatch in the trenches, you had no right to wear a wristwatch. In his History of the Illinois Watch Company, Frederick Friedberg relates the story of one such unfortunate man, writing that after the end of World War I, a lawyer was arguing a point of law in court when Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, that's his name, noticed that the lawyer was wearing a wristwatch. The judge halted the lawyer in mid-sentence and asked him if he served in the war. When the lawyer responded that he had not, Judge Landis ordered him to remove the watch, admonishing him that it was inappropriate for non-veterans to wear a wristwatch. As Aja says, ouch. Eventually, they became ubiquitous, and the industrial juggernaut increased the demand. New inventions were waterproofing, self-winding, shock and scratch resistance. They came up with a synthetic sapphire crystal that instead of glass across the face of the watch, so there was no need to cover because it didn't scratch. They still used, those synthetic crystals are still used on scanners, circuits, cell phones, and satellites. In 2014, Apple paid $700 million for screens on their smartphones and watches from those synthetic sapphire crystals. In 1931, the stopwatch was invented. In 1932, battery-operated watches. In 1970, the first digital watch. In 1983, the first plastic swatch, which reduced production costs to almost nothing. Watches led to a global timekeeping. There was no need for church bells, no need for public clocks. Today, men's watch market is second only to diamond engagement rings. I don't get it. I saw a TV show where these rich young men had an entire array of very expensive watches. Now, I understand they're very expensive because they're gold and jewel and intricate, but they're clunky and ugly, and I don't get it. Anyway, it's just my opinion. Sorry. Watches are luxury items, often the ultimate male status symbol. The first watches were rare and showed status. They were desirable. Through sheer proliferation, everyone wanted one, and there was one made for everyone, and now the fancy ones are the big status. In 1977, Jean Bokassa was the dictator of the Central African Republic, and he declared himself in charge of the Central African Empire, and he demanded that they make crown jewels. And Albert Jolis, who was the president of a company, Diamond Distributors in the country, concocted a cheap black diamond ring in the shape of Africa with the country of Central African Empire marked by this little diamond, and it was only worth about $5,000. This clever diamond guy who wanted to survive told the dictator that the ring was worth $25 million. The dictator was completely overthrown and had to flee, but he took his ring with him, and Jolis said, significant comment at the end of the book, quote, "It's a priceless diamond as long as he doesn't try to sell it." So the conclusion is that jewels reflect our desires back at us, and they show us who we are. And that is the end of Stone, Jewelry, Obsession, and How Desire Shapes the World by Aja RADEN. And she also wrote this great book about all the con artists, The Truth About Lies. So, the exciting news is that I have arranged to have a conversation with Aja, and we're aiming for tomorrow. I won't promise yet, but we're aiming for tomorrow. And I will also do a separate video on tarot readings on these two books, well, at least on Stoned. And there's some good history we can read about while we're at it, and some connections to modern politics that I think might be interesting. And I hope you guys enjoyed this, because I know people have asked me to try to do more amusing, distracting books, and I've done my best the past few books. I don't know what I'm going to do next week. I hate to tell you, it's probably going to be political. I hope that's going to be okay with everybody. And while we're doing that, I'm going to continue to do a chapter at a time in Controlling Women about the abortion fight, and in On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder about the 20 lessons on tyranny and democracy. So all we need is a class in, I don't know, maybe an art class or something, and we will have a very well-rounded curriculum. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this book as much as I did. I thought it was so interesting, so entertaining. Her knowledge of history is just remarkable. It was really fun for me anyway. And we will see what the cards have to say about all of it tomorrow. And in the meantime, thank you, and Slán go fóill and slánte.